Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage President, Chairman, and Chief Executive Officer, the Dow Chemical Company, Mr. Andrew N. Liveris. President and Chief Executive Officer, Walmart Stores, Inc., Mr. Doug McMillan. President and Chief Executive Officer, Dangote Group, Mr. Aliko Dangote. Chairman and Chief Executive Officer, General Electric, Mr. Jeffrey R. Immelt. Chief Executive Officer, Shanduka Group, Ms. Phuthi Mahanyele. And our moderator, 42nd President of the United States, the Honorable William Jefferson Clinton.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I'd like to begin by thanking Secretary Pritzker and Mayor Bloomberg for the enormous amount of work they and their teams have done to bring us together, and I'm very grateful. I'm grateful to President Obama for sponsoring this. This is probably something we should have done a long time ago. There are many heads of state here from Africa and political and business leaders from both continents. I do want to say that our thoughts are with the leaders of Liberia, Guinea, and Sierra Leone who could not be here today because they had to stay home to deal with the Ebola outbreak, and we wish them well. I told the panelists before we came out today that I hate panels that are over-directed, and I don't like ones where the members filibuster, but I do want them to be able to say what they have to say about this issue. We all want more trade, more investment, better ties. It is generally known that Africa is going to grow as it has for somewhere between 5% and 7% as a continent. 6 of the 10 fastest growing economies in the world are in Africa. That it may go to 7 in this coming decade. The middle class is growing, but in spite of the $80 billion in foreign investment and the $400 billion in exports we'll see this year, 3/4 of those exports are still in oil and gas, metals, and diamonds. So the potential for economic diversification is great. There are 650 million cell phone users on a continent of 900 million people. Only 300 million people with electricity. About 170 million people with genuinely good internet access. 23% of the people have a bank account, thanks largely to cell phone banking, and 5% have a credit card. So there are lots of obvious options here. To those of you, the small number here, who are interested in this subject but have not had a lot of contact with Africa, I think it is important to say, so that our African panelists don't have to say it, the obvious. It is a continent, not a country. And the laws of countries matter, and the practices and the cultures and the opportunities will be different from place to place. But all these panelists have a lot of experience on all the relevant issues. Now, this conference is well organized, so this is supposed to be about how business-to-business contacts can increase investment and economic activity. Then there's a panel on infrastructure. Then there's one on finance, which is a huge deal. Then there's one on government action. But I told our panelists not to worry too much because they'll have to say some things about the constraints and opportunities in these other categories. So with that as a background, I would like to start with Jeff Immelt, because General Electric has been involved in Africa for, I believe, 116 years, since 1898, and they're about to get the hang of it. So I want to ask you, in spite of AGOA, which I signed almost 20 years ago or 15 years ago, and all the things that have been done since, it strikes me that we've only barely scratched the surface of what we could and should be doing there, and that we're missing the boat. We should understand this is a massive opportunity for American business. So based on your experience, what do you want to say to the Americans here, and what do you want to say to the Africans here about what one or two things each of us could do to accelerate this process?
So thanks, Mr. President, and let me say thanks again to Penny and the President for doing this. I think it's a great step that shows the commitment and the potential that the region has. I would say to all of the, my fellow CEOs, the number one thing is get local. I think too many of us conceded this earlier in our careers to the Europeans, mainly because the U.S. market was so good. If you're an American of my age, really for a long period of time, you didn't have to travel much, and so we kind of gave Africa to the Europeans first and to the Chinese later. But today, it's wide open for us, but you have to get local, so that's step number one. I think financing is the number one gap, at least in the businesses we're in. And what's lacking, I think, is what I would say investable strategies that governments need to put forward. For instance, there's a right way to do a power purchase agreement and a wrong way to do a power purchase agreement if you want people to invest in it. So we need more convergence around good standards on behalf of the governments. And we need more risk capital. There's probably $25 billion of infrastructure investment in this room alone, but you all want to be the second person in after somebody else has taken project risk. And what we need is a good coordination of the U.S. government, OPIC, EXIM, World Bank, people like that, along with real investors who are willing to put skin in the game to get that first investment in. And that, so let's not kid ourselves about financing. And it's got to fit, it's got to be flexible. It's got to fit the African standards. So get local. We need flexible, risk-based financing. And then the third thing I'd say, Mr. President, and this is a small thing just on our behalf, I think all of us would benefit if there was some regional integration in Africa, an Eastern Africa alliance, a Southern Africa alliance that would add more than each country, that might put together 4 or 5 countries that we can invest behind. Those are the 3 things I would put forward.
Well, let me ask you one follow-up
Sure.
question very quickly. We don't want to get in the middle of Washington's political wars, but how important do you think it is for the future prospects of getting more financing in Africa for American businesses to renew the Export-Import Bank?
I've been on record. Look, there's a lot of things to be critical about big businesses and there's a lot of things that don't work in government, but exporting is not one of them, and the Ex-Im Bank isn't one of them. And the fact that we have to sit here and argue for it, I think is just wrong. There's 53 export banks around the world. U.S. on a relatively small basis is less than a lot of what Europe does or what China does. But more importantly than anything else, Mr. President, it shows the U.S. cares. And I'm not asking GE, Caterpillar, IBM, Dow. We're not asking for favors. We're putting our own risk capital up against it. But these projects need, I think, the hand of the U.S. The underwriting, if the U.S. underwrites a deal, if the World Bank underwrites a deal, risk capital comes in. So we punch way above our weight with EXIM. I think it speaks to the country's interest in a region. It's a competitive weapon. And it creates jobs here, lots of jobs, and it creates jobs in the countries we go to. So.
Thank you. Phuthi, you have established some remarkable partnerships with iconic American brands. And I know from talking to you backstage that you've got some very clear ideas about what should be done. From the African side, what do you think could be done to accelerate the business partnerships, the flow of investment, and the creation of jobs?
Mr. President, I think, thank you. Mr. President, I think more than just looking at what we as Africans can do, I think together what we can do is certainly look at areas that are challenging for us as African countries. And a key area for us is around the young people that we have in Africa. 15 to 25-year-olds in Africa make up 60% of the population of the continent today. And so a key issue is making sure that we have those people being educated to be able to contribute towards, the continued growth of our economies on the continent. And so in looking at our partnerships, and at Shanduka, we've been able to create partnerships with McDonald's and with Coca-Cola. That's been a key area for us. So for example, with McDonald's today, we employ 11,300 people in South Africa. And what we've done is to focus on educating and employing young people coming into our business. And so what we do is we have a significant focus on that. And so I think from a business perspective, it's important that we focus on education and empowerment of young people, so that as we go forward, we have the resources that we require to push the economies moving forward. And from that perspective, we will then have the capability to be able to continue to grow our economies in the manner that we need to do.
Do you think it would be helpful if these major American companies did more in the education and training area to design programs that are tied directly to the job market? I must say this is not just a problem in Africa. This is a problem in America. This is a problem all over the world. There is a job shortage for young people everywhere. Yeah. It was part of what triggered the Arab Spring and the Tahrir Square in Cairo. They were producing 400,000 college graduates a year. Absolutely. And nowhere near 400,000 jobs for them, because they weren't trained to do the jobs that were or might be brought there. So is this something we should do together?
Absolutely, yeah. It is working. Absolutely. I think we definitely need to be focusing on pushing for more education of young people together. I think it's a critical issue for us to focus on as we move forward, because if you think about it, what is the one critical resource that we need to move our continent forward and continue to grow? It's to develop our young people. And then from that perspective, to then be able to continue to invest in other areas. And we know that the various other challenges that we face. If you look sectorally, we know that there are a number of sectors that require significant investment. And so, from that perspective, what I would say is that for American investors coming into the African continent, the one thing that we need to be looking at is that, you cannot be looking at coming into the African continent with a perspective of being able to invest immediately. As many of you know, because, you've all been investors in the African continent. But it's the issue of making sure that we are willing to invest in the infrastructure requirements of the country that you're investing in. So whether it is investing in the people of that country or investing in the infrastructure requirement, it is very important to be able to do that prior to the actual investment in the business. Because, without that, then you won't have that continued growth of your business, and you won't be able to support the country that you're in as well.
Thank you. Doug, first of all, congratulations on your assuming the presidency of Walmart. You made your move in Africa partly by acquiring a company, Massmart, and you are successful in this country and around the world in no small measure, not just because you source from people who give you a good price, but because you have a brilliant supply chain operation. I think, based on my own experience working on trying to get AIDS drugs, malaria drugs, tuberculosis drugs to people in the last mile, trying to help very small farmers become part of a competitive market, that these supply chain issues are quite profound, but they should create an economic market. So talk to me a little about, why did you go into Africa by buying another company first, and what's your take on this supply chain issue, and whether it's both an opportunity and an obstacle to future investment?
It is the issue for us, and would love to talk about it. First of all, thank you for having us. We're just so honored to be here. I'm excited about Africa. Started going a few years ago, leading up to the acquisition that we made. And as we look at what we're trying to do in Africa, we are simply trying to provide customers access to fresh produce and other items at a great value. To do that, we've got to have a great supply chain. And in the case of Africa, we're taking some of the learning that we've experienced from Latin America and other parts of the world to invest and supplement in areas where it's needed. But all of us need to be doing that. We want to be able to take fresh produce, for example, and reach to small and medium holders, enable them to be more productive in their yields, to provide pack houses where they need them, to put the pieces in place to create the system that supplies the store, which also creates great jobs for both value-add goods as well as more commodity-type items, to lift the whole thing and have a system that works. So for us, it's a long-term proposition. We invested $2.6 billion in 2011, and that's just the beginning. And what we are expecting, and the reason we made the investment, is that we think the whole region, not just South Africa, but sub-Saharan Africa, including Nigeria, Kenya, and so many countries around the continent, are going to do the right things to create the right rules, the right transparency, some of those infrastructure investments so that the whole thing works. And we want to do our part. One of the side benefits that we've seen already is that we're tapping into those sources of supply for produce and even things like wine and exporting them out of Africa and selling them in places like the United States and the UK. And one of my favorite stories is about a couple of sisters who came back together after apartheid and formed a winery. It's called Seven Sisters Wine, and we're selling it in 500 U.S. supercenters and have sold about 5,000 cases so far. We never would have found them if we didn't have the presence in Africa.
Andrew, what's your take on the future of manufacturing in Africa? It's going to be one of the things I think is worth pointing out is while manufacturing is the single most rapidly growing sector of the economy in terms of annual productivity growth, therefore every year fewer people can produce more stuff, whatever that stuff is. The multiplier effect of manufacturing jobs in every society on earth is quite high. And if we get better infrastructure and if we do better with the supply chains, and we should be able to build manufacturing centers. But as Jeff said in his opening remarks, one of the things that has not happened within Africa is that the original promise of ECOWAS and SADC and the East African community and NEPAD to have basic multinational continental marketing and open markets and more free trade within Africa, I think is slowing down a lot of manufacturing investments that might otherwise come. So talk a little about that. What do you think we ought to do about that? And what can this conference do to help?
Thank you, Mr. President. I add my thanks to being invited here. And Dow doesn't have quite as long a pedigree in Africa as GE, but we've been there 60 years. And I think we all cut our teeth in learning on South Africa. And in the many decades of South Africa's forward progress, the one thing that we haven't discussed yet on this panel, that big companies like Dow, who bring their, and Walmart and GE, bring their supply chains to Africa, also have to face the continent's philosophies and practices beyond governance and bad governance, and beyond aid and how to use aid with how to address poverty. There is still a pie there that is expanding, but it's leaving a lot of people behind. And as you know, income inequality and jobs for youth and youth employment in general that you both touched on is the sine qua non issue of most developing nations. And the solution space we've been getting into here, like clustering, like free trade, like all the things you mentioned, I think designing an economy used to be thought of as a bad thing, you know, in making industrial policy and all that. I've been trying very hard across the world in my many travels with emerging nations to use Singapore, use Thailand, use a few other countries that have advanced their economies and generation skipped. And actually, you're not going to have to go through the learning curve of the United States and other industrializing nations of 100 years ago. You can generation skip, avoid the pollution, really create job multipliers, supply chains of the type you mentioned, 5 to 8 to 1. And instead of being a raw material exporter, which is obviously where you start first and where the Chinas get interested in you, American companies of the type that we are, especially GE and Dow, we bring value chains and we bring training and we bring actually that technology to you early through local partnerships. And we actually prefer the local partnership model. I'm Australian, as you know. I joined Dow with this vision of doing it in Asia, and we did it very successfully. We have 86 joint ventures around the world, in fact, where we prefer to be in those joint ventures. And I think this whole notion of going local and then creating clusters around advanced manufacturing needs to be brought to a nation state. If it never clusters, if it never creates regional clusters, so be it. But at least within countries of size, like maybe a Kenya, in fact, we have worked with the Kenyan government to in fact do exactly that. How would you approach designing this economy such that you can take advantage of the most important resources you have? Of course, you have agriculture, and you've got to bring that into the modern century and not waste food. But how about your people? How can you organize yourself so the infrastructure does get built with the precious capital you do raise? How can you actually, if you build it, they will come? How will you take on that mentality? And they're doing it in Mombasa and having actually a free trade zone and a port and actually building some industrial clusters, which is the beginning of these supply chains. And you can't solve it overnight. This is a generational move. You have to come in with the training programs at the grassroots level. As I speak, I have 41 Dow people and IBM people in Ethiopia training local students on actually how to do some of this stuff, working with NGOs so that, you know, in the schools. And I think these partnership models, and then of course, this is for Africa by Africans. So going local as fast as you can means reverse training. I think the great American model, the great American enterprise, has figured out how to go local around the world by bringing value chains and actually creating jobs. Advanced manufacturing, in a way, it destroys jobs. So what you've got to do is you can't do what we used to do. We're going to go steel, cement, petrochemicals, basic industries. That's not enough. You've got to really figure your way through advanced economy development learning lessons, like how do I complete an aviation supply chain, like Morocco has done. They've done that. They've got a huge aerospace industry there. There's a whole supply chain that goes with aerospace that they've been able to build and employ people. And, you know, this is really, we call it an advanced manufacturing plan. We work with governments to do that, and that partnership model, business, government, civil society, NGOs, working with schools, is the only way forward. And I believe Africa can generation skip if it does this faster than the learning curve of previous countries.
Well, just to follow up on that, I'll try to not editorialize too much, but I have to say this. I think that one of the great opportunities that the African leaders and business leaders have here is to add the value of their own natural resources before they leave the country, before they leave the region, before they leave the continent. And I think we really should, we need American investment funds, and there'll be several represented here, and there are lots who aren't here who are interested in Africa, to look at this value-added proposition. You know, I was talking with a group last night about the work we did in Rwanda to try to, you know, bring them a coffee roasting operation. We sold all that coffee for years at fair trade prices, but they were just coffee beans. Once we could roast the coffee and market it to the world, it made a huge difference. And they made so much more money, all of which they used to reinvest in their businesses, protect their topsoil, do all the things that you're talking about. Same thing with soybean processing. So I think the opportunities there would surprise even a lot of people who do a lot of business in Africa, but not in the value-added chain. There are lots of opportunities there.
Just the one example, your coffee example, cassava. Cassava is the crop of choice, starch of choice in Africa. They are not very good at producing cassava. So you can do research to help them complete the cassava supply chain in Africa. And we're doing work in Nigeria right now to replace wheat flour in bread with cassava. Then suddenly there's bread for Africans based on their crop that cuts out a whole lot of costs, and you can put it on your stores, in your stores. I mean, this is the sort of close the supply chain point you're making with coffee, which I think is there if you go local.
And the point I want to make to the investment here is there's actually money in this, real money. Africa, I think, is very underinvested. I wanted to, I got a lot of other questions, but I want to go to Aliko next because it's been interesting to me to watch your emergence, not from being a person who made a lot of money in the traditional industries to someone who is thinking about where you want Africa to be 5 and 10 and 20 years from now. And we were talking about Nigeria before we came out and how fortunate we've been, at least knock on wood so far, that notwithstanding the political turmoil in the north, which sometimes creeps into the middle of the country, the Lagos region has pretty much been able to operate and continue to grow at a very, very brisk rate, which is highly important for all Africans if you're going to build a continental model, because there are more people there than anywhere else. So just tell us what you want potential American investors to know, what you need the most, and what you think you and your fellow Africans should do to help us build more partnerships.
Thank you, Mr. President. First of all, it is great, to be here. Well, I think there's quite a lot, to be done. I think this forum will help in terms of bringing people together, in terms of bringing both Africans and Americans together for us to know ourselves. Because if you don't know yourselves, you are not going to do any business. And I think we've been partnering quite a lot of American companies. I know that a couple of them, they have an archaic information on Africa. They're still thinking about Africa of the last decade or the last 10, 15 years. Whereas really things have changed dramatically. Africa now has been growing at about 5.5% on average in the last, decade. And it means that when you look at the future is there. I mean, if we continue, Mr. President, to grow at 5.5%. And the 5.5% growth is actually without power. So if there's no power, it means that there's no growth. And when I say that there's no power, you look at a country, for example, like Liberia, where they have maybe 20 megawatts of power with a population of 3.5 million, or maybe 20 million population, from the state that I come from in Nigeria, where we're sharing 32 megawatts of power. So, I mean, there's actually no power there. But still, we've been struggling because of the massive, series of, transformation in terms of the macro, micro, and political stability has been there for some time. Of course, there's a little bit of issues here and there, but, we're growing. And if we continue to grow, even like this, the projection is that in the next, 36 years, which is 2050, to 5.5%, Africa will end up having about $15 trillion GDP. So, I mean, it's going to be a great story. We're growing very, very rapidly. And as you know, yes, there are a lot of perceived risk. People only talk about risk, but majority of them, they are perceived risk because people don't know the story. They have not really been there. And Mr. President, you said something that Africa is about 54 countries. Because some people, when you talk about Africa, people believe that, yes, Africa is like one state. I mean, somebody like me, I need about 37 visas to move around in Africa. So for somebody coming from Ethiopia, he needs 78% of the countries to get a visa and move around. So I think, like what Jeff even suggested, there must be this integration within us. It's a big market, and obviously I don't expect GE today to go and open up factories all over the place. But if they go to West Africa and they open in Nigeria, then there should be free movement of goods and services, either within, not even within the region, but within the continent itself. With us, we have looked at this and we have realized that there's quite a lot of opportunities in terms of investment. What are these opportunities? We've interacted with a lot of companies, and most of these companies, they're eager to go to Africa and invest. But the only thing is that they don't have the partners who really know Africa to invest with. So a lot of, most of these meetings that we've been having, I'm sure a lot of American companies must have actually zeroed down on 1 or 2 companies of which to partner with. And Mr. President, I would like to, announce that, for us at Dangote Group, we have actually have two major partnerships, one of which is the biggest, the partnership of Dangote and Blackstone. We have signed an MOU, which will be announced today. We're investing $5 billion jointly in power infrastructure and infrastructure across sub-Saharan Africa. And with this, we will definitely, close the gap. There's quite a lot of gap. And this gap, we know about the gap, and, it's there. And we're going to be very serious and very, very aggressive. So the two organizations will really make it work. And the second one that we have is with Carlyle. We have $1 billion, which is to invest in petroleum refining and also agriculture, petroleum refining, agriculture, and financial services. Because when they first, Carlyle went to, decide to do the Africa Fund, we took 10% of that, which is $50 million. But they eventually raised more than $500 million. They raised $728 million. So we're open, and I'm sure that there will be quite a lot of these deals. And I hope somebody will be out there to beat this $5 billion of our investment.
Just remember who sells power generating equipment.
Yeah, we do.
David, Steve, just want to get that in there.
Yeah, well, I think that's the purpose of this conference. I should have been your agent. Let me ask you a question about the power, all of you, related to the supply chains. And again, it's only based on my experience in 2 or 3 countries where we do business development work through the Clinton Foundation and our partners there. But Africa still has a lot of inequality in terms of economic opportunity and options, like all places, city to country. The one thing that has spread like wildfire, as it has all over the world, is cell phone technology, which is why you've got as many as 23% of the people having a bank account, because of the cell phone technology. And potentially you could have 2/3 of the people banking just on their phones, which is essentially what we're doing in Haiti today. And to some extent, at least based on my experience, where we have to have some power source to preserve medical tests, for example, when we try to build health clinics in rural areas. We need a combination, if we want to accelerate growth and make it even, of centralized power off the grid and distributed power through solar, wind, and biomass or solid waste. You do both. So what's your take on that? If you were the energy and development minister of any African country with a substantial rural population, would you pursue a dual strategy? And if so, what are the implications of that for investment funds and American companies wanting to do business there?
So I would say, Mr. President, you need both. So you've got roughly 100 gigawatt deficit of electricity in Africa. So it's just pervasive. I think the grid is not going to be invested in quickly enough. So I would advocate maybe leading with distributed power. You've got to solve for the gas availability issue. So, you kind of start with fuel. You've got countries that have hydro capability, and so hydro should be a real option. You've got countries that have natural gas, and the issue should be to get the natural gas priced the right way, that you can put it back in the system, get some pipeline or rail infrastructure to do distributed power. You've got countries that have wind capability, like Kenya, Tanzania, where wind can be applicable. And the sun shines in most places. So distributed solar is not going to solve Africa's challenges. So I would pick the countries that can get gas, do both large and distributed gas. The countries that have hydro, do hydro. There's going to have to be some coal in the mix. We're just not going to be able to influence it. We need to be practical about where that goes. We ought to have distributed solar programs throughout the region. And I think it's going to take a multitude of different things. But every government in this room should have a very transparent energy policy, and you should have a very transparent financing scheme. And you know, whether it's a bulk trader agreement or power purchase agreements, there's a right way and a wrong way to do those things to attract investment. Now, I would say, Mr. President, the things that can be localized here are gas. You know, you're going to have enough scale here to be able to localize some gas turbine technology. You can localize a lot of wind here. So not only are you solving an infrastructure issue, you're also going to solve a job issue. But I start with the fuels and then go to the structure. The last point I'd make is, I always say solve the easy problems first. Doing something like building a nuclear power plant is the hardest thing on earth to do. If you laid everything on earth down and picked the hardest, it's the hardest. I just don't think that's going to be a pervasive technology that gets advanced in Africa.
Andrew and Doug, you want to comment on this?
I do want to comment because this is a passion of mine, which is of Jeff's as well. Energy policy for nation states is something that they can learn from all the rest of us who got it wrong, and this country still doesn't have it right. And one thing that countries can do, and regions of course, is start at the efficiency conservation end and then work backwards into the grids and the fuel sources. Because if you go the fuel way and you say nuclear is too hard, you're paying the price of oil or its proxy. And that's a very hard thing to compete on affordable energy. Affordable energy for these countries is the sine qua non issue, because you're not going to get all the things that we want from competitiveness and job creation unless it's affordable. So start with the BTU you never ever use rather than the one that you create and pay too much for. So national building standards, generation skip in terms of smart city designs, like, you know, many companies are putting in place now. Work out your traffic patterns, work out your logistics, the whole notion of energy use in buildings. You know, we waste 40% of the energy we use in this country through bad buildings and lack of national building codes. If you can, in fact, intervene at the use level and work your way back into the fuel sources, okay, and if you're fortunate enough to have your own natural gas, which is, of course, the cleanest fuel you can burn, then use that domestically before you end up exporting it for the one-time gain that you end up getting. Or if you do that, bring that money back and do something wise with it in terms of using it within your economy rather than letting it get diffused away. I think this is all of the above energy strategy in my definition, Mr. President.
Well, let me just say before we go on to Doug, in his former life, Mayor Bloomberg, and at the end of his term, was the chairman of a group called the C40 of big cities throughout the world dedicated to greater energy efficiency and sustainability through clean energy in urban areas. And the Clinton Foundation was the basic technical implementer for a lot of this. And there are a lot of African cities today that are now in our coalition that are getting efficient bus rapid transit, that are trying to close all their landfills and use energy sources and do recycling, and are working up and down the line to get more out of what's there. And so it's no longer people thinking this is some touchy-feely, offbeat, irrelevant issue. And I think it's something that deserves more attention perhaps later in the day in the other panels. And I don't think there's any big company in America that's tried to do more on the sustainability issue than Walmart has. So what do you think about this? What is this as an opportunity for, in effect, creating energy through sustainability in Africa?
Now, just connect the dot between your point around investment and a business opportunity in Africa with distributed energy. You know, we are in pursuit of renewable energy everywhere where we operate around the world, and use a lot of on-site solar here in this country, use a lot of hydro and wind in Mexico. And in Africa, it just seems to me like there is a place, given the outline that Jeff gave us, for investments to accelerate this process and do some generation skipping. You know, what new equipment can do today compared to what old equipment used to require in terms of energy is dramatically different. And as I've visited a lot of stores in Africa and seen what our competition's doing and what we're doing, there's a lot of waste in the system that new money could generate not only more efficiency, but a tremendous return. I think there's an investment opportunity there.
I think, Mr. President, the other issue is also just looking at more involvement of the private sector, because it's still very much a public sector driven area. And we need to have more legislation that allows for private sector to participate in this. And then having looked at that, I would say that, you know, we need to have countries focus on energy sources that make more sense to them. Because, you know, if you look at gas, it's not necessarily the answer to every country. For instance, gas is not easily available in South Africa, but it is available in Nigeria. So, you know, you need to look at fuel sources that are available and make the most out of those. So if I were to look at it from a South African perspective, I would say that, you know, we need to use up the coal that we have, but then obviously also look at the renewable energy sources, which our government has already introduced, and that is already being done. And renewable energy, looking at the full spectrum, seeing what can be introduced first and then bringing that into account. But I think there's still quite a lot that needs to be done in terms of the regulatory side as well, making sure that we have that and having it in a manner that is investor friendly.
Liko, you want the last word on this?
Yes, sir. Yes, Mr. President. I think in Africa, I believe we can generate power from various sources. You know, some countries, they have all. I mean, Nigeria, we have hydro, we have coal, we have gas. I mean, today in Nigeria, we have potential gas reserves of 260 trillion cubic feet of gas. And we are not really even using up to 1 billion cubic feet of gas. So there's quite upside there, and you know, we can do quite a lot. But I think we need to pay a lot of attention to power. I think that's really the base. Because if we really want to have inclusive growth, most of these small and medium enterprises, they are not going to work unless we have power. I'm not really marketing for Jeff, for G, but I think
Feel free.
Okay. I think it's something that we need to do. I mean, it is very important and critical. Secondly, with this, our interaction between Africa and United States, I personally believe that it is very important and paramount to extend and renew Exim Bank's status. You know, because today, a lot of countries, what they are doing is that they have what you call credit in terms of when you want to buy equipment. And America today is very competitive because of the cheap energy that you have. It is very, very competitive because labor component in manufacturing is not much. It is the energy. So American equipments, they are very, very competitive. If that is not renewed, I think there will be a bit of an issue.
First of all, we're all having a vigorous agreement on this. I find it amazing. Economics is not theology. And if you're running a country, you've got to try to create an opportunity for all your businesses to be competitive. That's all the Exim Bank does. I've heard more ridiculous things said about the Exim Bank in the last 6 months than I have in my adult lifetime. I also believe it's very important to extend AGOA and to improve it. I think we could do AGOA in a way that would encourage more economic diversification in Africa. And I wish that not only our African panelists, but others here would give some thought to that. You know, right now, we just want to get it extended, but we ought to think about how to craft the extension so that we can support the development aspirations of the various African nations and what the people really need. Look, we're out of time. We haven't talked nearly enough about education and training, about the equal inclusion of women and girls and the economic plan for the future. There are so many things that need to be said about finance, infrastructure, energy that presumably will be said later. But I hope that everybody who's here, because you're interested, though not yet involved, is now more interested and more determined to be involved. And I hope that all of our African friends who are here will accelerate the opportunities we have to do things together. I think the United States and its business community need this relationship as much or more as Africa and its business community. This is a very important part of our future. And I'd just like to say one final thing. When Ashish Thakkar was up here talking before we came out, and I one more time heard his story, and I thought of all the people who were driven out of Uganda and the amazing stories so many of them have made, it reinforced something that we shouldn't forget here. Intelligence, dreams, and the willingness to work are evenly distributed throughout the world. Investment, opportunities, and systems that reward smart behavior are not. That's really what this is about. All of us are being given a chance to either do our work like the Gates Foundation and I do, or to make a lot of money out of the fact that this gap has occurred, which should now be closed. And I see the World Bank President, Jim Kim, out there. He's going to help us do it. The American government's committed to help us do it. But just remember his speech. In a way, that may be the most important thing that's occurred on this stage this morning. The guy drops out of school at 15 and does what he's done in the last 18 years, and he should never have had to leave home a single day to do that. We want to create the African home as a place of opportunity for Africans and for those who want to work with them. And I think we should give our panelists, especially our African panelists, a big hand. Welcome them here.
Ladies and gentlemen, please remain